Pokemon Pocket's Mythical Island expansion is only 1 day away, so let's take a look at the best decks in Pokemon TCG Pocket entering the Mythical Island expansion, and then we'll be able to look back at this and see what changed post the first expansion in the game. It is very fitting that the arguable, if not undisputed, best deck in the original base set Pokemon Pocket game is Pikachu EX. Pikachu EX is a definitionally elite deck, an aggressive deck that has a lot of different options with good costs, good power, and good flexibility. The deck typically switches between a Blitzel Zebstrika package, a Pikachu Raichu package, and of course an Electrode Voltorb package. The cards that are very rarely being switched around are most of the trainers and items, of course, and Pikachu EX itself alongside Zapdos EX. Pikachu EX is the premier early game threat in the game, with an attack that does up to 90 damage on 2 energy, 120 HP, and a very cheap retreat cost. Zapdos EX has many of the same upsides. It pokes for 1 energy, it does big damage for 3 energy, has 130 HP, and of course, a 1 retreat cost. This deck leverages energy advantages in every possible way without actually running an energy battery. All of its attacks are cheap and have unique impact. It has cheap retreat cost. It's a great deck for X speed. And the deck on the whole is the defining aggressive deck of this format entering Mythical Island. When I describe Pikachu EX as the defining aggressive deck, that is placing it in a little bit of contrast to Mewtwo EX, which is a defining, albeit a little bit slower deck. The decks that are the best in the game exist on a bit of a spectrum, and Mewtwo EX is sort of in the middle of that spectrum. It is also specifically reacting to Pikachu EX in some of its card choices. For example, base Mewtwo is basically just there to soak a turn and give you extra time to get set up and get your Mewtwo EX rolling. Mewtwo EX, of course, attacks for 150 damage with 4 energy, and can use a bench Gardevoir in order to constantly spam out that attack. This deck, in its success, is representative of the power of EX Pokemon, even in a format that only has 3 prize cards, of which EX Pokemon are 2. The reason this is so strong is because Mewtwo EX will take out nearly every EX Pokemon in the game. There are some exceptions: Charizard, Blastoise, Venusaur. Those are really kind of it. It'll deal with all of the legendary birds, it'll deal with Pikachu EX, it'll deal with Arcanine EX. With Giovanni, it'll even deal with Exeggutor EX, which is a pretty tanky Pokemon. The basic logic with this deck is that it gets set up easier than any of those things that can actually live through a Mewtwo. Because Mewtwo EX is a base Pokemon, you don't actually have to go through all the hoops of evolving into your big EX sweeper. All you need to do is get him out there. The thing that you're jumping through hoops for is Gardevoir, but that can happen on your bench. It's a lot harder to disrupt. And even when you aren't on a Gardevoir battery plan, you are able to still deal with a lot of what your opponents can put on the board because you are consistently able to access Mewtwo EX, whereas a Charizard EX, Venusaur EX, Blastoise EX deck is much less going to be able to consistently get to their big bad sweeper because it's stage 2. This means that this is the second deck that defines the pre-Mythical Island metagame. Mewtwo EX is the slower version. That's not to say it's the slowest deck in the game, but compared to Pikachu EX, a lot of things are slow. The innovation of running Arcanine in Charizard decks breathed new life into the archetype, which was otherwise getting strangled out of the metagame by Pikachu EX. This inclusion of Arcanine EX gives the deck an actual way to win the matchup against Pikachu EX, which was otherwise basically unwinnable. The deck has always had a fundamentally decent matchup against Mewtwo EX because Charizard EX is bigger and hits for more. So if you're able to get it set up, it can deal with everything Mewtwo EX can throw at it because it will live a Mewtwo EX hit and it will hit the Mewtwo EX and beat it. This is not, of course, foolproof, but it does give it relevantly good positioning against a powerful matchup. The issue is that without the Arcanine plan, you have very little recourse for anything against Pikachu EX. You just aren't able to really handle what it can bring to bear, the pressure it has, the lack of evolutions that it has to jump through to get to anywhere that can beat you up. This Arcanine inclusion does not make that matchup favored. If it did, I think this would be the best deck in the game, but it doesn't, so it isn't. The Arcanine inclusion makes the matchup winnable, but it's still an uphill battle. That is far better from the previous situation, where every time you saw a Pikachu EX, you could basically lock in an L. Since Pikachu EX is so widely played, it has forced this adaptation. And when we talk about the defining decks of the metagame, I think it's important to note that both Mewtwo EX and Charizard EX are defined in relation to Pikachu EX. They have both had to adapt in various ways. This deck more than Mewtwo EX, but the inclusion of base Mewtwo as a stock card is purely because Pikachu EX exists. That is the deck that has made these changes cascade downward across other decks. We now enter the Misty portion of our programming. When I wrote out my notes for how I wanted to organize this tier list, it was basically, you had those 3 decks and then just Misty, which encompasses a wide range of decks. So we're going to talk about 2 of them. What we're not going to do is talk about 18 Trainer, because I consider both of these decks a little bit better than 18 Trainer, even though I enjoy playing 18 Trainer a little bit more. This deck looks to go late a little bit better with Greninja as a stage 2 evolution, alongside, of course, the Articuno. That is an excellent carrier of Misty. All of these decks have fairly similar win conditions some of the time, which is to say all of these decks have free Misty Articuno wins in them, where you just draw Articuno, you draw Misty, you get a couple coin flips, you Blizzard on turn 1, you Blizzard on turn 2, the game ends. And having free wins in your deck is incredibly relevant. And this is a deck that actually has a lot of genuinely good things going for it, and what it has going against it is mostly the type advantage that Pikachu EX has over it. When you look at the cards in this deck, you can understand why, as a baseline, the things that it's doing are so incredibly strong. You can go late with Greninja, chipping damage onto things, adding in extra damage. It attacks pretty well too. You have a bunch of chip damage on Articuno's Blizzard, a very strong Pokemon, free wins off of Misty. All of that is great. Your entire deck is weak to Electric, and the best deck in the game is an Electric deck. And then the next best deck in the game is the Mewtwo EX deck that does 150 to everything in your deck, and all of your stuff dies to 150 too. And so this deck has a lot of really awesome tools, but ultimately ends up falling short compared to those 2 decks, despite the fact that those tools are as strong as they are. This version is even more stark in comparison to Pikachu EX, because Starmie EX and Pikachu EX, when you look at them, Starmie EX looks stronger. No retreat cost, 90 damage, but it's not conditional on having stuff on the bench. The difference between these decks is actually just the difference between Zapdos EX and Articuno EX. Zapdos EX is just a much better Pokemon. And when you have a Pokemon that is that much better, I think that that's a big part of what pushes the Electric matchup so difficult, makes it so difficult for you to play as the Articuno Starmie deck. I mean, obviously, the type matchup is also terrible. When you run into your opponent's Zapdos EX and they 40 you, and then they X-speed the Zapdos EX out, and then they bring in a Pikachu EX that does 110 to you, you just die. And that is ultimately what holds this deck back. The other deck, I think, is more able to access that Greninja dimension, the ability to go late, the ability to have these cute chip damage wins combined with the ability to have these Misty wins. This one feels like it just is inferior to Pikachu EX, not in a raw play pattern sense, but in the sense that you will very often lose the matchup against Pikachu EX, and your other matchups look fairly similar to Pikachu EX's matchups, which makes it hard to justify playing this deck unless you just really love flipping coins. Weezbok is the final, I would say, elite deck in the game. It's the final deck that sort of exists on that second tier alongside the ones we just talked about to me. There are other rogue decks that are sort of pushing toward that tier, but when you look at decks that are sort of generally grouped with this, you have like Alakazam decks, Gengar decks. I feel like it is significantly stronger than any of those, and I will also note that there is one difference between the deck that I run and I think the deck that a lot of people run here. I'm including non-promo Jigglypuff here because I like having 60 HP. I am not 100% on this. If you want to play the promo Jigglypuff, be my guest. But the reason this Jigglypuff is in here is not to do anything other than get to Wigglytuff. And so I value being able to get to Wigglytuff more since I'm running a one-of Jigglypuff. The worst thing that can happen is it dies and my Wigglytuff gets stranded in a game where that actually matters. Now, the way that this deck functions is not really reliant on Jiggly Wiggly at all. In fact, you don't necessarily need to be playing it, you can just be playing the Team Rocket package of Arbok and Weezing. This deck has some real power in it. It is able to stall about as well as anything in the entire game. It has unique power in terms of dealing with both Pikachu EX and Mewtwo EX. Weezing, excellent against Pikachu EX. It's very hard for it to hit its damage breakpoints against that. You can stall them out really meaningfully with Weezing and Koga. You have Arbok in order to trap a weakened EX in there and end up trading high in terms of trading one non-EX Pokemon for one EX Pokemon. You have a lot of ability to do that against Pikachu EX, and of course you have a type advantage over Mewtwo EX, but it's not the kind of type advantage that super duper matters because it can allow you to race them down if they get the Mewtwo active, but you're definitely still on a clock when they get to that point. The deck has a lot of play to it. It's one of the more complex decks to play in the game, in my opinion. And I like the inclusion of Wigglytuff EX because it gives you a coin flipper's chance against basically anything. If your opponent gets set up and you get your Wigglytuff EX out there, you put their thing to sleep, you can beat anything with a couple of good coin flips, and having that coin flipper's chance in the deck is valuable. Here's where I'm going to take a potentially controversial stance. To me, that is the end of the true meta decks. There are other decks, like I see people playing other decks in tournaments, but to me, once we've talked about that group of decks, we are kind of done with decks that have proven themselves as being able to be successful in this metagame, and we are much more into speculative territory. And if we're going into speculative territory, I think it's worth talking about the under-the-radar decks that I think are interesting and could get boosts from a new metagame or a different context or from cards that come out in Mythical Island. So I wanted to start with Venusaur. I prefer thinking of this as an Exeggutor EX deck, and I think that's really what I'd like to get at here. Exeggutor EX is one of the best Pokemon in the game at mitigating the weakness of going first in Pokemon TCG Pocket. Exeggutor EX also has the unique situation of the normal Exeggutor not being all that much worse than Exeggutor EX, which means if you're not willing to put yourself in bad situations in terms of prizes, running just normal Exeggutor can help to mitigate that as well. Being able to attack for 30 to 60 each turn is relevant and dangerous on a 130 HP body for only 1 energy. Exeggutor EX is better, but in a deck like this, it also carries weaknesses. If you're down 2 points when you evolve into your big boss Venusaur EX, suddenly they can Sabrina out something that is only worth 1 point, one-shot it, and it doesn't matter how big your Venusaur EX is, and that is the weakness of Exeggutor EX in this deck. What I'm really trying to get at here is both Venusaur EX and Exeggutor EX have room to grow. Right now, these are two cards that are being played together, not because they specifically go together incredibly well, but because there's not a lot of good other options for them. You could try Butterfree stuff with Venusaur EX, but it ends up just sort of being worse. You can try Lilligant stuff with Venusaur EX, but that, I think, is definitely worse than Exeggutor. And so you end up with a deck that doesn't necessarily have a cohesive identity so much as it's two halves of good cards together, and that's the kind of deck that can really grow with Mythical Island. Here is an example of a relatively underexplored Exeggutor archetype. This is Exeggutor Wiggly. I covered this a few weeks ago when it did very well in a tournament, and I think the deck has some real potential to grow. It's an aggressive deck that relies a lot on coin flipping, which means there is a degree of intolerance to the playstyle in the metagame at the moment, but I do think that this is a deck that has some real potential going forward, and because it's so underexplored, I think that there's a world where this kind of strategy ends up being a lot better if it just gets 1 or 2 unique things applied to it. One of the things that's really going through my mind is, are we able to play some form of, are we able to make this some sort of hybrid Mew EX deck? Does that actually allow us to do anything? We have the new Execute that gets energy onto itself, that can be grass, that can allow you to splash Exeggutor in a bunch of different stuff without actually running grass energy. Is there a world where we can do that? Is there a world where we want to be putting grass energy on Mew EX in order to activate its ability and copy a Mewtwo EX's ability without discarding 2 psychic energy? I don't know. But this deck has such baseline power, and I think it's possible we get quote-unquote better versions of Wigglytuff that I think there's real potential in the archetype. When Promo Mankey released, it was hyped as a counter to Pikachu EX. It's a little less than that. Even as a counter, it can end up being a little bit situational. Primeape's general lack of bulk means that it's not necessarily the easiest thing in the world. Mankey's lack of bulk means that sometimes you just get 40 plus 10 and your Mankey goes away entirely before you can even attack with it. Sometimes you just get 40 and your Mankey goes away before you can even attack with it. It's not great. But when you're able to set it up, it is the kind of thing that has game into Pikachu EX, which is rare. Not a lot of things have game into Pikachu EX and play a similar style to Pikachu EX. But this deck does do that. Takes an aggressive posture with an EX Pokemon in Marowak EX that can hit incredibly hard. Unfortunately, the downside to Marowak EX is it can also not hit at all. And I think that over time, people have moved away from this as a major part of the metagame. It doesn't solve the Pikachu EX problem in a strong enough way to justify the rest of what you're doing. It is a reasonable and good deck, and the reason I'm putting it on here is because when I look at all of these cards, all of the cards from Mythical Island that we've seen so far, I don't see anything that meaningfully deals with Pikachu EX. But I do see, Aerodactyl EX that's fighting type. That might be an interesting thing to actually get in here as just a card that does damage. I see stuff like that, and I think maybe it's possible that Mankey Primeape might be relevant going into the future. What I am confused about, though, is what is their plan to distribute this promo Mankey, if anything? Is that going to be in Mythical Island? Or is there going to be a way to get that? Or is there just going to be absolutely no way to get a unique game piece that might actually be important to the metagame? I think I'd be pretty frustrated if there was no way to get it. All right, y'all. I'm really excited for Mythical Island. I really, really want to be playing like a lot on day one. I want to be spending a lot to get all these cards on day one. So I really cannot wait to see what Mythical Island brings us. My ultimate fear is that it's more of everyone's favorite lightning rat, because I'm not sure many of the cards in the deck or in the set that we've seen so far seem very good against Pikachu EX. Pikachu EX definitely seems like the kind of deck that will remain strong. I suspect Mewtwo EX could remain strong as well. We'll see how it adapts to Mew EX. Charizard EX running into Mew EX is probably going to be pretty sad. That's a potential opening in the metagame for another deck to take on the biggest guy role. But I do think it's a little bit hard for anything to take on the biggest guy role when Mew EX exists. We could be entering an even faster metagame. As always, I've been Cam Best, aka Cam Pocket. It was a little bit scary for me to do this. This is kind of like the kind of content I do in Marvel Snap. And I do think that like adapting it to Pokemon Pocket can be a little bit difficult. So I really hope you enjoyed it. As always, I've been Cam Best, you've been Cam Pocket. You haven't been Cam Pocket. I've been Cam Pocket. What are we doing?